A Christmas special. We've got a huge audience here in Maidstone, and we're going to begin with some reflections on the year. For me, 2023 was a big year.
In a fiery critique that's bound to resonate with millions of struggling pensioners, Nigel Farage has slammed the government's decision to axe the Winter Fuel Allowance for 10 million pensioners just as the nation heads into the harsh winter months. With a $22 billion deficit and a staggering $2.7 trillion national debt as the backdrop, Farage is calling out what he sees as a cold-hearted betrayal of Britain's most vulnerable. He's not pulling punches, accusing the government of balancing its books on the backs of those who need help the most. Farage's bombshell isn't just about economics, it's about morality, fairness, priorities of a government with a massive parliamentary majority. Pensioners, already battered by rising costs and energy bills, are now being left out in the cold, literally. This isn't just a cut. It's a political grenade that could spark outrage across the country, and Farage is positioning himself as the voice of reason in the chaos. With winter approaching, this decision could come back to haunt the government, and Farage is making sure they feel the heat. Now, watch this video.
What do manifestos mean? Well, not very much really, because Keir Starmer gave no indication at all in the run-up to the election that Labour would remove the Winter Fuel Allowance worth £200 to £300, depending on circumstances, for up to 10 million pensioners in this country. Funny, that's the same Keir Starmer who said in 2022 that he feared for people's future if this allowance was removed. And indeed it's true that cold kills. Labour themselves thought up to 4,000 people every winter would die if this was removed. So they're going to do it. They're not going to back off. I guess they have to fund the public sector pay rises somehow. Funny, they say they found a £22 billion black hole. Folks, that is baloney. I'll tell you how big the black hole is. It's 2.7 trillion pounds. Yes, that is now the size of our accumulated national debt. So sure, we have problems. We've got a budget coming at the end of October. Government has to try to encourage growth, but it can't cause it itself. The reason I'm so opposed to removing this allowance is because already our pensioners, indeed the rest of us, and not just us domestically, but our businesses, our manufacturing industries, we have the most expensive energy in Europe, and we pay way more than the Americans. We kind of insist on not producing our own natural gas. We insist on not producing as much oil as we consume. We insist on not producing coal in this country, which is needed for proper steel manufacture. And the fact we've cut our carbon emissions and gone for renewables faster than anywhere else in the world, folks, that's why our energy is so expensive. And just a few days ago, there was a big auction for wind farm developments offshore and onshore. Huge uptake, nearly all by the way from foreign companies, but a huge uptake because the price that Ed Miliband has agreed is way, way above current market prices. Our energy bills are set to soar over the course of the next 10 years, not go down as we were promised during the election campaign. That, I can promise you, is wrong. And given just how much of their income people, particularly those on fixed incomes, pensioners, many of whom, by the way, this year will be dragged into paying tax, which seems almost incredible for people not on very big incomes. For that reason above all, the cost of energy, the fact it's going to go up, is why I feel so strongly that the Winter Fuel Allowance should not be removed.
Nigel Farage's explosive critique of the government's decision to cut the Winter Fuel Allowance has thrown fuel on an already blazing fire of public discontent. As millions of pensioners face a potentially freezing winter without this critical support, the question remains, is this a necessary measure to address Britain's mounting debt, or a heartless betrayal of our elderly population? Farage has made his stance crystal clear. Now it's your turn. Do you agree with his fiery condemnation, or do you see it differently? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We're listening. Labour has once again turned its back on British pensioners, continuing a pattern of betrayal since taking office. Instead of prioritizing the needs of our elderly citizens, the government has chosen to funnel billions into foreign aid while cutting vital support at home. This time, it's the Winter Fuel Allowance, a lifeline for millions, being sacrificed on the altar of fiscal mismanagement. Nigel Farage doesn't mince words. He argues that slashing support for pensioners to tackle a PES 22 billion deficit and a PES 2.7 trillion national debt is not just misguided, it's outright cruel. Instead of targeting the most vulnerable, Farage calls for a rethink, cut bloated government waste, reduce foreign aid spending, and overhaul the immigration system, which he has consistently highlighted as an unnecessary financial burden on taxpayers. The removal of the Winter Fuel Allowance is more than just a policy decision. It's a moral failing. It risks plunging millions of pensioners into energy poverty, leaving those on fixed incomes to face a brutal winter amid rising living costs and soaring energy prices. Farage frames this as yet another example of labor's inability, or unwillingness, to support the people who built this country. With a significant parliamentary majority, Labor could have chosen to protect the vulnerable. Instead, they've chosen to balance the books on their backs. This isn't just bad policy, it's a cold-hearted betrayal. Farage is calling it out. Will the government listen?
So I think people are frankly aghast at that. But I've got over 22,200 pensioners who are furious about the withdrawal of the fuel allowance, terrified of the rising energy bills. They've just gone up in October. They're likely to go up again in January. Who knows what the temperatures will be?
It's interesting. Sorry to interrupt you, Richard, but on that exact point, I was talking to John McTernan, who is a former advisor to Tony Blair. I'm sure you've come across him, about an hour ago, and I suggested, I wasn't trying to scaremonger or anything, but I suggested that there will be people who will freeze to death this winter because of Labour's actions. He said that was alarmist and irresponsible. Do you agree with him?
Sometimes the truth hurts, and it is the truth.
Richard Tice's bold attack on fuel allowance cuts, a calculated move to champion pensioners with over 22,200 pensioners reportedly outraged and fearful. Richard Tice has skillfully leveraged this figure to bolster his critique of the government's fuel allowance cut. By using a specific number, Tice adds credibility and heft to his argument, even if the data source remains unspecified. The sheer scale of the claim reinforces the narrative of widespread discontent and positions this as a crisis deserving urgent attention. If the figure holds up under scrutiny, it could become a powerful rallying cry in both media and public discourse. Tice's focus on fuel allowance cuts amidst rising energy bills strikes at the heart of a nationwide issue, framing the government's decision as a betrayal of one of Britain's most vulnerable groups, its pensioners. His critique aligns with a pressing concern not only for the elderly but for countless voters grappling with soaring living costs. It's a sharp, populist strategy that makes the energy crisis feel personal and immediate. By framing this as a failure of leadership, Tice positions Reform UK as the party of compassion and common sense, hammering home the slogan "People before politics." This sharpens his broader critique that the government is out of touch with the everyday struggles of ordinary Britain. Reform UK is painted as the defender of pensioners and working-class interests, standing in stark contrast to the perceived elitism and mismanagement of the current leadership. Tice's statement is a textbook example of effective political messaging, humanizing a policy failure while presenting his party as the solution.
However, rhetoric alone won't suffice.
To truly capitalize on this momentum, Tice must back up his critique with clear and actionable proposals that demonstrate how Reform UK would do things differently. Without this, his words risk being dismissed as empty populism. The numbers are staggering. 100,000 pensioners could fall below the poverty line, with 50,000 more sliding into fuel poverty next year, and another 50,000 by 2030. These aren't just statistics. They're a damning indictment of a policy with fair, reaching consequences. For pensioners already living on the edge, this is more than an economic issue. It's a humanitarian crisis. The timing couldn't be worse. Energy prices are skyrocketing, and pensioners' incomes are stagnating or shrinking. This toxic combination creates what critics are calling a perfect storm of financial insecurity, threatening to push even more vulnerable households into desperation. By focusing on relative fuel poverty, the crisis highlights not just individual hardship but systemic inequality, painting a grim picture of a society failing its most vulnerable. For Richard Tice and Reform UK, this is more than a policy misstep. It's a moral failure of leadership. They argue the government has abandoned its social contract, prioritizing budget cuts over the basic needs of its citizens. Pensioners, who should be protected after decades of contributing to society, are instead bearing the brunt of fiscal austerity. The message is clear. Policymakers are out of touch with the everyday struggles of ordinary Britons. The long-term outlook is equally bleak. Another 50,000 pensioners pushed into fuel poverty by 2030 signals a deepening divide between the haves and the have-nots. Beyond the immediate suffering, this could have knock-on effects, including increased strain on healthcare systems as cold-related illnesses rise. The government's approach risks stoking public discontent and widening social inequalities. As winter looms, the stakes are high. Public anger is simmering, and the visibility of this crisis will only grow. Mishandling this issue could lead to a full-blown political backlash, eroding trust in the government and damaging its electoral prospect. This is more than a policy debate. It's a test of the government's priorities and its commitment to the most vulnerable in society. The clock is ticking, and the consequences of inaction will be felt far beyond the cold months ahead. Thanks for watching. Stay connected. Don't forget to like and subscribe to keep up with our latest videos and stay ahead of the curve on the issues shaping our world. For even more, join our free Telegram group, link in the description, for uncensored, no-holds-barred discussions on the topics that matter most. Be part of the conversation. Your voice counts.